Welcome to this webinar today on infrastructure as decay and decay as infrastructure. My name is Naja Kleist. I'm a senior researcher here at DIIS, and I've been looking so much forward to this webinar. I can see on the list of participants in this webinar that we are people from many different places. First and foremost, we have Akhil Gupta from California, where it's morning, so good morning to you. We have other people from the States, we have people from Denmark, other places in Europe, and from the Horn of Africa, so good afternoon or good evening, depending on which time zone you're in. My name is Naja Kleist. I'm a senior researcher here at DIIS, and as I said, I've been looking so much forward to this webinar, which is the second webinar in a series on analytical approaches to infrastructure that I'm organizing with my colleague Jeff van Orban.
Yes, thank you, Naja. Really glad to be here and to have Akhil here with us as well. I'm really looking forward to the talk and the subsequent conversation. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you. So Jeff and I are organizing this webinar series to investigate, explore different kinds of analytical and theoretical perspectives on infrastructure. And we think that is interesting and important for many different reasons. One is that infrastructures as kind of connection systems and apparatuses can be seen of some of what makes a modern society practically possible, connecting activities, phenomena, etc. It can be said, as Brian Larkin said in the last webinar, to be the systems that enable other systems to work. But there are also a lot of questions and ambivalences in relation to that. For instance, who are included or excluded in different infrastructural projects? What are their temporalities, maintenance, construction, ruins, etc.? Something that Akhil Gupta will talk about today. What are the political aspect, governance, geopolitical histories that infrastructural projects relate to? And what about those infrastructures which are not tangible, say like infrastructures of capitalism or mobile money or the internet, which might seem intangible, but in fact might also have tangible material aspects. So there's so many different aspects to explore and to think about how do we study them. So when planning this webinar series, Jeff and I were brainstorming and we decided to be shamelessly ambitious. So we were like, who would be like the top people, the leading scholars to invite to this? And we made this list and we were like, we could also invite Akhil Gupta. That would be like phenomenal if he would say yes. We reached out to our top speakers, including Professor Gupta, and amazingly everybody said yes. So this is a real pleasure to have this talk with Akhil Gupta today. And to me, who are now slightly old, I'll say that I have been inspired by Akhil Gupta's work for many years, first as an undergraduate student, throughout my PhD, and as a researcher. So when I realized that Akhil Gupta is also doing this very significant work on infrastructure, I was like, but of course. So also therefore, it's so great to have you here with us today. This is a webinar and we have practical information as with seminars. So if you haven't done so already, it's really great if you would introduce yourself in the chat function to give everybody a sense of feeling that we are more people in this space. And when you do so, please choose the participant and attendees function so that it reaches everybody. For questions, we have the Q&A button that you are very welcome to write your questions during Professor Gupta's talk, and of course afterwards. And we also have the thumbs up function for that. So if you see that somebody has written a brilliant question that you just would have written yourself if you had been faster, please use that button and it will move up in the order of questions on my screen. We'll have a talk for about 20 minutes from Akhil Gupta, and then it will be followed by Q&A, as I just said. We decided to extend the discussion a bit longer than the original scheduled 45 minutes, but so we can go up to what is 6 o'clock Danish time, so a bit less than an hour from now. So Professor Gupta, as you know, is a professor of anthropology at UCLA. He's also the director of South Asia and the Center for South Asia and India, and not least, he's the president of the American Anthropological Association. His current work focuses on transnational capitalism, infrastructure, and corruption, and he has also done a very significant work on issues on development, post-coloniality, the state, and many other issues, including rethinking how to think about notion of time, space, place in anthropology, and more generally in social theory. And when I was preparing for this webinar, I had a look at his CV, which is absolutely overwhelming, so I cannot pay justice to it here in terms of publications, awards, professorships, etc. But I will highlight just one publication here, and that's the edited volume called The Promise of Infrastructure, that the Professor Gupta co-edited with 2 other editors. It's a really, really great book from Duke University Press. If I had been in my office, I would have held it up and showed proof of how thoroughly I have read it. It's a very good book, and you can actually read the introduction, which is, I'll say, key reading on infrastructure for free. It can be downloaded from the book's website at Duke University Press. And there's also a really great chapter from Akhil in that book. So with no further ado, I look so much forward to this talk, this webinar today. Akhil, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Naya, and thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm delighted to be here. Also, thank you all for staying late in the day for you in Copenhagen and people who are at various time zones all around the world. I know it's somehow this way of doing things has actually enabled more people to come together in some ways, and at the same time that we miss face-to-face interaction. So I'm going to start by just sharing my screen with you here, and so I'll run through the slideshow while I'm talking, and that way hopefully I'll keep up with what I'm saying and what you see on the screen. Okay, so let me begin by talking about 2 interlinked, one second, So there are 2 interlinked registers in which we think about infrastructure and decay, right? One, the first type here is materials that make infrastructure rust and wear out. So the decaying over time due to material degradation. And the second is the ruination caused by the infrastructures of the Industrial Revolution. And you can see there are many such images of whether you look at energy use or materials use or whatever, there's a sharp, steep climb once we get to the Industrial Revolution of energy use and other material use. So in fact, so the decay is in fact literally fueled by decaying matter, which is that the fuel, oil and heat and things like that that have been stored in the earth through a process of decay. Now, today I'm going to talk about a very dull topic in some ways, which is maintenance. And I'm going to talk about how maintenance keeps infrastructures functioning, how maintenance staves off decay. It's unglamorous and it's uninteresting compared to the heroic masculinized activity of invention and construction. But maintenance is critical to understanding the temporality of infrastructure. Okay, what would be implied for our understanding of infrastructure if we look carefully at the loving care of maintenance? Okay, so that's the question I ask in the paper, in the presentation today. So there are two ways in which we can think about how the Industrial Revolution and the subsequent era has been narrativized. One way of looking at it is through conventional ideas, what I call the Whiggish themes of economic enrichment, growth, spectacular civilizational achievement, rising standards of living. So if you can think of the last 200 years of civilization, you can talk about it in those terms. And those are the normal development, that's development discourse. That's the way in which we've been taught to think about what has happened to the world in the last 2 centuries. In the Anthropocene, there is in fact a different way in which we can talk about the same period, which is that we can re-narrativize the Industrial Revolution to emphasize colonial plunder, the reliance on decaying matter, and ruination. So we can talk about ecocide, we can talk about how modernity, mass slavery is fundamental to modernity. We can talk about genocide, we can talk about war on a world scale, etc. Things that, in fact, are normally left out or suppressed or somehow framed in a positive light in the other discourse, right? So from the perspective of the Anthropocene, the Industrial Revolution was in fact a giant attempt at ruination, right? So what it has done is that stored hydrocarbons have been utilized to bring the planet to, wait, hold on. I don't know why it went there. Okay, sorry. So stored hydrocarbons have been used to bring the planet to the brink of ruin. So deposits of past biological organic matter have created climate change, which now threatens to ruin the life on the planet, all life on the planet. So in most scholarly and popular discourse, however, it's still uncommon to describe the Industrial Revolution in the language of decay and ruination, right? Rather than the language of progress, growth, civilization, the birth of a new era of well-being, safety, and prosperity. Now, infrastructure plays a central role in this larger dialectic of civilization and ruination, of development and destruction, of construction and decay, because it is a key technology that converts stored hydrocarbons into sources of energy that has given us capitalist development. The larger societal and civilizational processes between regeneration and decay are mediated by infrastructure, right? So if you think about regeneration and decay, what mediates that is infrastructure. And this has been obscured in part by the rhetoric of the civilizing mission, the political story about the rise of the West, and the lofty economic goals of economic development. So what I'm suggesting is that we think of infrastructure and ruination in 2 interlinked registers. Infrastructures ruin in their capacity to act, and it is only because they ruin can they act, right? So when you, for example, build a coal-fired power station, you cut down trees, you destroy the immediate environment in order to build the plant. So there's one kind of ruination that enables the infrastructure to be built and operate. But then in operating it, so in doing what it's supposed to do, which is use coal to generate electricity, you're also creating ruination in that you're using up stored hydrocarbon, you're releasing carbon and nitrous oxides into the atmosphere, etc. Right? So the very act of doing what they're supposed to be doing creates ruination in infrastructure. So infrastructures cause destruction in their very creation. And this is what I call the Janus-faced side to infrastructure, right? So infrastructures are always Janus-faced. Okay, so these two sides are different sides of the same process. So we have to see both the fact that infrastructures have given us the spectacular series of economic growth, et cetera, but they've also given us decay, destruction, et cetera. And those two things come together. You can't separate one from the other. Okay. So now I move from that larger dialectic between creation and ruination to to talk about the issue of maintenance. So the argument here is that decay should not be of concern just when infrastructures fail. So it's often said of infrastructure, something that I don't actually believe and I don't think is true, but it's often said of infrastructure that it only becomes visible when it breaks down. And so a spectacular way of breaking down would be, when it breaks down, then you notice the infrastructure, but then you also notice the fact that it needs maintenance, right? That it needs repair. So my argument is that, in fact, you can take that and think about maintenance more generally and see that infrastructures exist. They exist over time because of maintenance, because they start decaying from the very moment that they are built. So they don't have to fail for you to see decay. That decay happens from the very moment that they are built. So the materials that are used in infrastructure start degrading from the very moment that they are employed. And were it not for the careful work of maintenance, most infrastructures would not last what we consider to be their lifetime, because the lifetime itself is constructed because of maintenance, right? So it's something that we completely overlook when we think about infrastructure. Okay. So what I'm suggesting is that maintenance lies between infrastructure's construction and ruination. In the poetics of infrastructure, the drudgery of maintenance pales when compared to the heroism of construction and the romantic pull exerted by the elegiac in ruination. So I propose maintenance as the third term that inserts itself between the poles of creation and decay. To the extent that infrastructures, in fact, project solidity and endurance, it is because the overlooked activity of maintenance keeps decay at bay. Now, so I'm a little ahead of myself. The temporality of infrastructure focuses on construction, on processes of construction. So there's a lot of attention that's paid to infrastructures when they're first planned, there are controversies, there are debates, and then when they are built, again, there's a lot of attention to the fact that this new bridge is coming up, this new subway line or metro is being constructed, etc. There's a lot of attention paid to it in that process. And then once it starts working, then all the attention ceases, right? Then nobody is concerned anymore with it. It's there, it's working. What else are you going to say about it? In fact, that is when some of the most serious work begins on the infrastructure, which is the work of maintenance, right? So what I'm suggesting is that the attention that is given to the period of construction and the period of planning and construction, that is the before life of infrastructure, is not matched by an attention to the during life of infrastructure. And sometimes you have, in fact, people paying attention to the afterlife, what happens afterwards, right? So then it becomes object of archaeological or historical interest. But during the time that the infrastructure functions, people pay attention to what happens to it. So why is that the case, right? So let's ask ourselves just the question, why do we ignore infrastructures when they are in fact functioning and pay a lot of it as compared to the attention we pay to them before they start functioning? So what is often privileged in the construction of infrastructure is the heroic overcoming of obstacles, both natural and social. A bridge like this one, the Golden Gate Bridge, which defies what was thought technically possible, or a railroad that traverses treacherous mountainous terrain, inspires the kind of awe that was previously reserved for the sublime in nature, right? So today, the Golden Gate Bridge is largely appreciated for its aesthetics, but most engineers even today know that it was a technological marvel, being both the longest and tallest suspension bridge in the world at the time of its construction during the Great Depression in 1933 to 37. So how do we remember that? Well, we have lots of plaques, right, that commemorate these narratives of heroism and the conquest of impossible odds. And these reshape the experience of that infrastructure for subsequent generations. And they re-invoke the danger and impossibility for people who might otherwise fail to experience such feelings in encountering the object. So aesthetic or technical virtuosity in the design and construction of buildings and bridges and other such things invoke feelings of the sublime. So that's my argument about how great feats of engineering have taken the place of great vistas of nature. You know, so it's a kind of similar experience. So if you take the example of the Golden Gate Bridge again, a visitor today who has seen longer suspension bridges, or someone who knows nothing about the engineering of bridges, might still appreciate the bridge's aesthetic beauty, but that experience might be diluted by the fact that they've seen images of that bridge as a symbol of San Francisco or a symbol of California. People may even have seen a copy of the bridge if they have seen the one in Lisbon before they encounter the original. So the encounter with the bridge is today highly mediated by the circulation of its image, so that it's experienced through the image, the icon through the symbol, and vice versa, right? So the bridge itself becomes a simulacrum of its images. So this dizzying, saturated world of the bridge's images makes it impossible to experience it as an aesthetic or technological sublime. So what I'm suggesting is now we're in a place where we can no longer experience these objects with that same feeling of awe and grandeur that we once did. Okay. So infrastructure dies as an object of debate, contention, and appreciation at the very moment when it becomes useful. But even before it is completed, it starts to decay. So it's the work of maintenance that prevents infrastructure from ruination. And it is essential to the temporality of infrastructure. Maintenance keeps that which is constructed from decaying, or at least decaying faster than its lifetime is supposed to be. Yet the very concept of lifetime of an infrastructure presumes the work of maintenance that is often forgotten in the stories about how that infrastructure got built. Maintenance is routine work. It is unglamorous. It does not appear to push the borders or boundaries of technology or aesthetics. Maintenance partakes of a general devaluation of the routine in the project of modernity. Right? So is that in modernity, the routine is always devalued as compared to the creation. Innovation and novelty are ends in themselves in this view, and end when the object has been built. What is most important socially or what contributes most to the life of a community is less valued than what is novel. So in the modern world, innovation becomes an end in itself, the most prized and valued human activity. In this world, maintenance suffers by being the equivalent of feminized labor in the household. Maintenance is considered dull, routine, everyday work. However, without the caring labor of maintenance, the beauty of heroic masculine construction would never last. What we see and what we would see is premature decay, that is natural decay, the degradation of materials at various rates. The awe-inspiring infrastructures of modernity would decay much faster than those that have been carefully maintained. And nothing illustrates this better than the writing on this plaque, which you cannot read, but which I have put up here. And I'm not going to read it, but you can see here that it's a story about two great men who were responsible for the Golden Gate Bridge. And the engineer Strauss goes to A.P. Giannini, who's the founder of the Bank of America, which is based in San Francisco. And it very kind of delicately says that Giannini had a vision of serving fully California's growth. Well, the point was that the Bank of America was really interested in using the forests of California to the fullest extent possible. And the forests were in the marine headlands, so the bridge enabled you to go across and carry those things and bring them to the port in San Francisco. So Giannini asked Joseph Strauss, the engineer, how long will this bridge last? And Strauss replied, forever. He said, forever. If cared for, it should have life without end, right? If cared for. And I highlighted that because I think it says something so important about the role of maintenance, okay? Let's look at another example. So this is again some plaques about that are given by various engineering societies about the Golden Gate Bridge. So this is how we encounter a lot of awe-inspiring infrastructure, right? Through these kinds of plaques. Okay. So in fact, it raises the question, what does the lifetime of infrastructure mean, right? So when we say a bridge is supposed to last for 100 years, or a bridge is supposed to last forever, what does that mean? What does that depend upon, right? And we often completely gloss over the fact that it depends upon certain routines of maintenance that are not just maintaining. Actually, maintenance is itself a misleading term because it's not just maintaining, but as I'll argue, it's actually changing the infrastructure. Okay. All right. So I've just gone over that. So let's take another example, which many of you know about already. This is the Ponte Morandi, the bridge in Genoa, Italy, that collapsed, killing 43 people in 2018. This was hailed for its innovative design when it was first built in the 1960s. It was considered an architectural marvel, soaring light and airy over gritty parts of the city. The beauty of the bridge lay in its simplicity. I think this image is getting a little cut off, but you can see that there were these three towers, A-frame towers, 300 feet high, holding up a roadway using 12 supports. So there were just 12 points at which the bridge was being held up. And of course, what happened was that when one of the supports failed, the entire bridge came down, right? So we know this as a modern tragedy, but of course, what we don't realize is this is not specifically a problem with that one bridge, but most of the infrastructure in the industrialized countries of the West is now in that state, right? Because it was all built around 100 years ago. So what I want to point out about the Ponte Morandi was that it was not a conflict, the classic conflict between aesthetics versus function, but so much as between aesthetics and maintenance. So the bridge collapsed because the design did not have a way to incorporate routines of maintenance. Right? That was the problem with the bridge. Now, as you can see, the white of the bridge is really concrete. So what happened was that the cables that are normally inside those white supports, those cables have been encased in concrete. And what happened was that the concrete started cracking, water started seeping into the concrete and started rusting the cables. The problem was there was no technology available to see what was happening inside those concrete structures, right? So you could not assess the degree of degradation of the cables, of the steel cables inside because of the concrete that lay over it, right? And as a result, in fact, by the time that the bridge opened to traffic in 1967, the concrete shell had already developed cracks in it. By the late 1970s, a decade after the bridge was first opened for traffic, Morandi, the architect, the great architect who designed it, himself inspected the bridge and concluded that it had seriously degraded. So, degradation in this bridge went on at a very fast pace. A professor of engineering at the University of Genoa said that well-designed bridges last 100 years and then need maintenance, but not after less than 40 years. Again, that's a completely misleading statement because, of course, even well-designed bridges need maintenance all the time. And that's the point I want to make. So this was a big dramatic infrastructural failure. And there were other parts of, it's a very interesting story. We can discuss it more later, but there were other parts of it as well. But the point I'm making here is that designer created the conditions that resulted in a fatal accident by not considering how the bridge would be inspected and maintained. Right? So in creating the bridge, nobody thought, how are we going to inspect and maintain this, right? And had they done that, this design would have been proved unviable. Yes. Okay. So I'm very close. So Graham and Thrift argue that, So Graham and, okay, so we can talk about this later, but there's a new bridge made by another famous Italian architect, Renzo Piano, that has replaced the old one, and this is what it looks like. Now, what I want to come to is that Graham and Thrift argue that catastrophic failure of the kind witnessed in the case of the Morandi Bridge hides the importance of larger processes of routine breakdown and failure. If you acknowledge decay and breakdown as an expected part of infrastructural systems, you can re-examine the distinction between innovative creation and routine maintenance, in which routine maintenance is not considered secondary as compared to construction, innovative construction. In fact, they argue maintenance is how societies learn, because that which is maintained is never simply restored to an original condition, but it is always altered during repair. So when you're doing maintenance, the materials that you're working with are not being restored to the original condition, but you're making them work under new conditions, right? Maintenance and repair often result in innovations that enable infrastructures to function for periods that are far beyond what they were designed for, right? And in fact, to take on new functions that were not even envisioned. Okay, so coming back, for example, to the Golden Gate Bridge, the Golden Gate Bridge requires 38 painters who work on it all year round to maintain its international orange color and prevent corrosion from the salt air. So if it was not maintained, it would basically fall apart in a very short period of time and would not have lasted almost 100 years now that it has. Okay, so maintenance involves the constant work of reproduction, the replacement of degraded parts or parts that were considered unsafe, but it is much more than simply keeping the structure the same as before. Okay, and what does it mean to keep something same when the materials are rusting, warping, or degrading, right? So decay is inherent to inorganic materials as much as to organic life and to human plants, in short, to the assemblages that constitute infrastructure. The tendrils of decay reach into every part of the infrastructural assemblage. Okay, so I have a little bit, I say a little bit about, I'll talk about, let me just come to the conclusion. I'll talk a little bit about how one studies maintenance and why ethnography is particularly good for studying maintenance, because of the rhythms of ethnographic work actually match the rhythms of maintenance in some ways. But let me conclude here. I'm going to just read out a little bit to conclude. So in this talk, I've conceptualized infrastructures both as creating decay and experiencing decay. They are the causes of destruction because of despoliation that must occur for them to exist, as well as for the consequences that ensue from their use. Nothing illustrates this point better than the role played by the steam engine and the internal combustion engine as the motors of the modern capitalist world. But infrastructures experience decay themselves in that they are subject to dissolution, degradation, breakdown, and change. The art of maintenance is what keeps them functioning even as they change and decay. Maintenance therefore plays a critical and easily overlooked role in the existence of infrastructure. Much more of our attention is drawn to the creativity and ingenuity of construction and design than to what is seen as mere maintenance. Routines of upkeep that are seen as requiring less skill, mental ability, or training. Such a view is entirely mistaken. Maintenance is that critical third space between construction and decay, between building and degradation, and between the future and the past. Attention to maintenance allows us to conceptualize the work of repair as a creative and critical function that enables innovation and discovery so that infrastructures can function even as they degrade. It is not merely routine work. Working against one strand in the literature, I think it would be a mistake to celebrate and romanticize maintenance as another heroic act. For this reason, we must see how maintenance may serve to exacerbate existing inequalities or perhaps even create new vectors of inequality. So I stop there.
Thank you so much for this really, really great and insightful presentation. So much to think about. And I really like how you both turned the history of modernity and infrastructural works during modernity upside down. I mean, this is really very important and reminds me of Paul Gilroy's work on the Black Atlantic, how we sometimes forget that the modernity in Europe and America was built on the slave trade, basically. So the question that sprang to mind to me was something you touched upon in the end, which is how to study maintenance and study these temporalities that might be very long. And there's also a question about that, a very eloquent question from the audience that I'll just read aloud. It's from Prashant Chakraborty, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing. So the question reads, what would be the methodological pathways through which we can ethnographically study the maintenance of infrastructures? How must ethnography be calibrated for such tasks? If decay is kept at bay through maintenance, then how does the ethnographic study of infrastructure actually discern decay and ruination? Additionally, how can ethnography of maintenance also pay attention to scale from the planetary to the urban, local, and intimate? And how do we account for political questions of neoliberal divestment and privatization? So a lot of questions here, so you might choose just a few, but please.
Yes, yes. Thank you for that question, Prashant. I think it's a critical issue. Actually, I have a part of the talk that it'll be in the publication that I have to cut out for reasons of time. That is precisely about why I think ethnography is particularly suited to the study of maintenance, because they are both slow processes that unfold over time, that are looking at changes, at subtle changes that happen over long periods of time, as opposed to kind of dramatic things that happen. So ethnography is process-oriented rather than event-oriented in many ways. We look, even when you look at events, we look at how the events unfold over time, what the consequences are, what the processes are that are going to the making of the event. So in many ways, ethnography is very well suited to the job of studying maintenance. Also, a lot of what I see as the strength of ethnography lies in the fact that we look at everyday routines. We look at that which is, the everyday is very important in a way in which it is not for sister disciplines like political science or even history maybe. But ethnographers are immersed in the everyday. That's what we write about. And so in that sense, then, in fact, if you're looking at an infrastructure project, then studying the routines of maintenance can actually help you conceptualize what's going on there in a way that's different from the way in which something that focuses on the controversies and the aesthetics is likely to do. So we're likely to see the underbelly, the underside, the everyday forms which enable infrastructures to survive and to change, and to the forms of innovation that keep them working. So that's why I have a kind of extended paragraph on that, which I didn't have a chance to speak about.
Okay, thank you very much. And now when planning this, we decided that Jethro and another colleague will also be, they will answer, or they will pose a question live. So now Jethro, please go ahead.
Yes, thanks Naya, and thank you Akhil as well for such a captivating talk. My question was actually on a similar kind of trajectory to the last one, perhaps more focused on kind of historical dynamics, because I was also captured by the complexity of temporalities that the infrastructure kind of insinuates. I think it's interesting that when many of us think about infrastructure, particularly in terms of visually spectacular feats of architectural design that you're kind of talking about, it intuitively leads us to kind of think about space and how infrastructure stretch out across space and enable different spatial configurations. But actually in this talk, the focus through maintenance is very much on temporality. And your recent book on the promise of infrastructure emphasized the visions of the future and future mobilities. And then on the other hand, there's also the kind of deep historicity to infrastructures, that they're kind of rarely built from scratch. They frequently overlay each other, but they're the product also of kind of multiple political technologies and rationalities. And so as such, they have multiple histories and temporalities that are not always coherent, as you share in the discussion of the kind of Janus-faced industrial revolution. I think even the temporality of decay itself is complex. Depending on the infrastructure, it could also be kind of a long or a short descent into entropy without maintenance. And I'm also curious to see whether you think whether we can talk about digital infrastructures as subject to decay or maintenance in the same way as a bridge or a water system does. But so yeah, I guess to sum, I was hoping if you could sort of elaborate on how you think we can theorize or make sense of this complexity through ethnography or other frameworks that to kind of account for the sheer diversity of ways, I guess, in which infrastructures have these multiple histories and temporalities.
Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you. That's a really fantastic set of issues. So you're, first of all, I think you're absolutely right that in this talk, as well as in the book, we focus on the temporality issues around infrastructure as opposed to spatiality. And that was actually quite deliberate because we felt that a lot had been done on spatiality and infrastructure and not enough on temporality. And so we wanted really to kind of say, time and space obviously come together, and people have been paying a lot of attention to how infrastructures connect across space, and that this is the thing that marks what is an infrastructure, is that it connects people, institutions, markets, whatever, across space. But we wanted to say, well, all spatiality unfolds over time, right? So there you have to look at the temporal dimension, and there's not been as much attention perhaps paid to the temporality as there has been to the spatiality. So we wanted to especially talk about the future, how in the book, edited book, how the future is one of the ways in which most societies are the future orientation of societies can be revealed is through the investments in infrastructure, because very often those investments are 30 years, 50 years, 100 years. So unless you have in fact, you're making a statement about what kind of future you want by building certain kinds of interests. So if you're building highways, then you're saying, okay, we are going to be driving cars for the next 50 years because the investment that you made now won't pay off for that period of time, right? So you're making an investment in the future. And very often in thinking about the future, there's been a sense that, we really can't say much about the future because the future isn't here yet, but we can say a lot about the past, right? And in fact, the argument is that we have visions of the future and we have a sense of the future in what we are doing today, right? So thinking about temporal. So the historical dynamics and the fact that very often existing infrastructures have to build on previous infrastructure. So if you have a water system for distributing water, the chances are you're going to take that system and rejig it with modern technology and then use it, rather than completely dig it up and throw it out and redo the entire thing from scratch. That rarely happens. And so in the big cities in the world, for example, if you look at water, sanitation, infrastructures, they're all extremely old. They've been put there, they're more than 100 years old, and they're constantly being fixed by maintenance. They're not really being redug and redone from scratch, and that's often the way in which new infrastructures come. They have to be compatible with previous ones. You have to be able to continue to use the previous ones. They're rarely done as a complete replacement. And this is where I think that there might be a difference between infrastructures like electricity or water and sanitation and digital infrastructures. Because what often happens with digital infrastructures is you just throw away the old and then don't even bother making them backward compatible. So you may have a phone, and in 3 years you cannot use it because none of the apps are now working in the old phone. So you're you're being forced to throw it away, basically. And in fact, it's leading to a huge problem with waste and stuff like that. So we are kind of, the fact that we don't have routines on maintenance and upgrading equipment as part of the design is leading to all kinds of new problems, right? And continues this dynamic that started with the excavation of coal, etc., of just using and throwing away. And it's not sustainable. We all know it's not sustainable. So it's a real question about where the speed up in electronics is leading us in terms of, this is not a sustainable way to design. and it's not a sustainable. So why are we doing this? And can we not think of a better way of doing this? And in fact, if you think about maintenance, most of the electronic stuff you get cannot be maintained because you can't, as a user, open it and do things with it, etc. Unless you are a very, very technically savvy user, but the ordinary person cannot do that, right? So the more we remove things from easy maintenance and prepare them and have them ready so that they can be thrown away, and design them in such a way that they need to be thrown away, the more we are kind of renewing this kind of cycle of the high throughput societies, which create enormous amounts of waste and material use, right? Which is clearly not sustainable. So it's an issue that I'm afraid has not received as much attention. And if you think about all the people who are doing innovation in the electronic world, very few of them are thinking about sustainability in this way, right? Okay, so yeah, so that's one of my thoughts about digital infrastructures. The other thing is, of course, that it's very disruptive to have new technologies that don't articulate with older ones. And in the digital world, it has become now normal to say to somebody, here, I'll give you a new word processing system, but you know what? All your old files, you can't read them anymore. and people are, okay, I guess that's the price I have to pay for technical change. But is it? I mean, should that be the case? And how does one kind of really think about the relationship between the old and the new in a way that helps preserve some of the continuity that you see with infrastructures like water or sanitation and so forth? And that's a question. I don't know the answer to it. That's a question that I ask.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you for bringing up the issue about sustainability. I think that's something we need to keep talking about. And that plays beautiful into the next question that is from Jennifer Hart. And she writes, what role does maintenance play in infrastructure that was never probably completed in the first place? I'm thinking about colonial infrastructures, for example, which are marked by incompleteness and disinvestment from the very beginning.
Yes. Great question, Jennifer. So what do we think? How do we think about infrastructures? That there are two different cases that one can think of. One is infrastructures that were never completed, that were left incomplete, either by colonial, in the colonial experience, or even if you think about, a lot of cities in the third world today, especially poor neighborhoods, the way people build is that they keep building their homes according to the money they have. So they build, like they'll build a house, one room will be complete, a second room will be started, but there'll be no roof on it, etc. And then they get more money, they finish a little bit more of that, etc. So it's a kind of ongoing project, and it takes a whole lifetime to actually build a house, depending on their savings and so forth. And that's another way in which infrastructures are incomplete. But the third way in which they are incomplete is when routines of maintenance are not possible, or the skill is not there to do the maintenance, or when infrastructures are plonked down into contexts in which nobody's ever thought, oh, well, how are we going to actually maintain this thing? And that too happens quite often. So you have plenty of examples of all three of these types of infrastructure problems. And then the question becomes, of course, so what are you maintaining then? I mean, if it's an incomplete infrastructure already in ruins, then what are you maintaining? And that's a really interesting question. I don't know if I've seen anything in the literature that thinks about that, but it's a great question. So I would encourage you to, kind of pursue that if you're not doing it already in something that you're working on.
Okay, thank you. We now have another live question, and that's from our colleague Per Schoten, who has been doing work on infrastructure for a very long time. So I thought it would be suitable for Per to ask a question as well. Please, Per.
So, Akhil, first I want to thank you for an amazing presentation. It was really mind-blowing, and a lot of notes that I made, which will keep me thinking on for a very long time. Now, I want to start my question by picking up on the anecdote of Joseph Strauss and the plague on the bridge in San Francisco. Yeah. So he reminds me of someone who, at the same time, on the other coast of the US, was also very busy building infrastructure, Robert Moses.
Oh, yeah.
The brilliant biography by Robert Caro, which highlights that, if anything, infrastructure is political. And of course, the story of the genesis of this kind of new metabolism after the Industrial Revolution, this kind of coal-fired infrastructural building century, if you could call it like that, is also the history of the state. And if you show us that infrastructures or material relationships are just as high maintenance as social relations, could you tell me what your work on infrastructure and perhaps the differentiation between the spectacle of construction and the importance of maintenance, how does it form a window into the anthropology of the state?
Yes. Okay, thank you. Thank you. I think you brought up a really important point, which is that I often talk about infrastructural assemblages rather than infrastructure, because I think the materials there's too much attention to the materials and not enough to the social relations that are responsible for the materials to be there in the first place and being organized in that way, being used in that way, being in that landscape at that particular time, and so forth, right? So all of that is a social process and not so much one that's simply about materials. But the materials are one object in assemblage. So basically, if you think about a highway, for example, there's a lot of the work of maintenance is really the work that is being done by bureaucracies of various kinds and so forth. So the bureaucracies have to be seen as part of that infrastructure, not something that stands apart from it, that here's this material thing called the infrastructure, and then there's this other political entity that's supposed to be looking at it and in charge of it in some way or whatever. But if you think of all of that as being part of the infrastructure, so the social relations that go into the making and functioning of that infrastructure are part of what that infrastructure is, then you can do exactly what you're saying, is that you can step back and say, what were these relationships that enabled this infrastructure to come into being in the first place, and then allowed it to be maintained and kept functioning in certain ways. And one of the things that I mentioned at the very end of my talk is that maintenance also creates inequalities. So of course, we know that construction creates inequalities and so forth, because we know how often, for example, polluting infrastructure is placed in poor neighborhoods and often in neighborhoods of people of color and so forth in the US. There's a very clear pattern to that, right? But maintenance